Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and last year with the remake of Silent Hill 2, I put together Pyramid Head's helmet. So yes, there is a full build tutorial, painting process, and free templates available for this over on my website. For Halloween this year, I figured let's go ahead and finish the build off by making his great knife. Now the thing that's fantastic about this particular prop is even though it's 55 inches in length, because it's made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, it weighs in at a whopping 1.5 pounds, which is absolutely fantastic for cosplay. Now, the other thing that I always like to say when it comes to prop making is the paint makes the prop. And I am very happy with the painting and weathering process on this one. Lots of rust and gore and just everything that makes it fantastic for Halloween. So, even if you've seen me build multiple swords in the past, definitely tune in to the painting process on this particular one. And I want to show you what it takes to put the great knife together, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I did was print off my template. Now the main body of this is going to be made out of some stacked 10mm foam. I'm going to do a rough tracing and cut around the template. That way, after the pieces are stacked and glued together, I can cut them out at the same time. Using some 1-2-3 blocks, I trace around the template and the rough cutout. As my main support running throughout the middle of this knife, I'm going to be using a 1/4-inch fiberglass yard marker. To embed the rod into the foam, I'm going to be using a router attachment on my wireless Dremel. After tracing a guideline to follow, I can start at the end of the marking and slowly pull the rotary tool towards me. Now the bit in this rotary tool isn't quite large enough, so I switched over to a stone sphere bit to enlarge the gap just a little bit more. Then I could take some Bob Smith superglue and embed the fiberglass rod into the 10mm foam. To sandwich the two halves together, I'm going to be using some Weldwood contact cement. And of course, I'm going to be wearing my respirator while applying the adhesive. And I did apply 2 thin coats to both sides. After the adhesive had been allowed to dry, I could then start at the handle and work my way towards the tip of the blade. And here you can see I just need to remove the excess foam from the outline of the template on the handle. So I end up tracing around the main part of the body onto some 6mm foam. This will help bulk out the blade, and I need to do this 2 times. Since I already have the template out, I go ahead and remove the lower section that will eventually make up the bevel. I mark the back line so I can line it up properly, and then I can add more contact cement to the 10mm and 6mm foam pieces for this side. I again start by lining the foam up at the back, and then working my way to the tip of the blade. This fabrication process can then be repeated for the opposite side. And the main blade is now made up with some 10mm stacked with 6mm pieces on either side. With all of my foam stacked together, I can now cut away any excess material to match the initial template. Using my template, I trace the bevel to the opposite side of the blade as well. This is going to give me a guide to remove and refine to make the sharp part of the knife. Because I'm cutting through multiple stacks, I break out a brand new blade for this project. And what I'm going to be doing is following this guideline to remove as much material as I can to the middle of the 10mm stack. Now this process doesn't have to be perfect at this point, I'm just trying to minimize the amount of sanding I'm going to do later on. With a bunch of the material removed, I can now take this over to my sanding station and refine this bevel using my rotary tool. A little bit of heat can then be applied with the heat gun, and I can look for spots that need to be refined even further before I move on to the next step. Referring again to my template, I can then trace onto the handle the parts that need to be rounded over. I'll also add a slight round over to the opposite side of the handle as well. I'm just trying to match the game models that I've found online from 2001. And needless to say, the graphics back then are a little bit different than they are now, so there is room for interpretation. Now there is a detail on the side of the handle that I'm going to cut out of some 6mm foam. For those that don't know, this great knife is 1/2 of a giant pair of scissors, so this is where the 2 blades would interlock together. With a little bit of heat applied, I can then glue this piece onto the side of the handle. In the game, there's also a little circle detail at the end of the handle here. Then I can use a punch tool to score into the foam. Now here's where I'm going to try a technique that I've never done before, but in my mind it should work. I'm going to lay down some liquid black Flex Seal onto the foam. This is similar to Plastidip, but it's a little bit thicker, so it's going to build up more of a texture. I decided to protect parts of the blade using some frog tape, and then I could just apply the liquid rubber directly to the foam using a balled up paper towel. Now the reason I'm doing this is because, like a latex masking, I'm going to add colors on top and then hopefully be able to take them back down to the Flex Seal. Now I'm going to apply a couple of thin coats of Plastidip over the entire prop, covering both the foam and the Flex Seal. Along with this, I'm going to dust on some Krylon Red Oxide Primer and some Rust-Oleum Flat Antique Nickel. Now here is hopefully where the magic happens. One thing I love from the movie is seeing paint shred away from the metals and leave some ragged bits. So to replicate this, I'm going to use a sanding sponge, and I'm going to sand back down through the layers of paint and Plasti-Dip all the way down to the Flex Seal. And I will say that I was a little bit worried because at this point the blade was almost done, so if it had really messed it up, I would have been a little upset. But for all the additional effort, I will say I do think this surface looks really good. Now when I was sanding in the very beginning, I did get a little too heavy-handed, and I accidentally applied too much pressure and actually removed some of the Flex Seal. But here you can see I just easily take some Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black and I paint in those sections. To prep the blade for additional layers of paint, I'm going to start by adding a wash of Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black to the entire body of the sword. At this point, I'm steering clear of the beveled section. It's going to get its own treatment later on. Like you've seen me do on a lot of different props, adding this wash does a few things. It does start to tint the prop itself, and it starts to knock back all the additional colors. But that acrylic, even though it's thin, attaches to those primers, and it will make subsequent layers of paint adhere that much better. Now I can start to address the blade section on the knife. I mixed together some iridescent rich silver along with a little bit of the Mars Black. This will be applied to the bevel in a downward pulling motion with that 1-inch mop brush. Visually, this will start to add a striation to that part of the blade that will separate it from the main body. Once that paint application had fully dried, I can then take more of that iridescent rich silver, this time without the Mars Black. And with no water added, you can see how I use the brush to create specific strokes along the blade's edge. I'm getting to the point where this blade definitely needs some rust. So to achieve that, I'm going to be adding some Liquitex Heavy Body Red Oxide. This paint is going to be watered down and painted directly onto the surface. Now normally I'd have to be careful with this application and only put it where I wanted it to go. But because the Flex Seal is water resistant, the paint is only settling in the spots that are foam with Plasti-Dip and primer on them. For the beveled part of the blade, the red oxide is thinned out more than I used on the top. So after painting the red oxide onto the blade, that same damp paper towel is then going to be used to disperse the paint around and diffuse some of these areas. Of course, I've done rust in other videos. This is just an additional option. Feel free to also check out my videos on how to make foam look like metal and my Fallout combat armor. Now I'm going to start to darken and grime the blade up using some burnt sienna and Mars Black. These two are going to be mixed together in different ratios. That way I can step back, look at the prop, and see are there areas that I want to draw the eye to or push the eye away from. I will say another thing that you could do is if you did not add texture in the beginning, you could add different types of textures into the paint right now. Just like I had done before, I start to pull these paints down the bevel of the blade to give it a certain striation. To highlight the very edge of the blade, I'm going to be painting on some iridescent rich silver with a small filbert brush. Also from here on out, I'm going to be adding a lot of blood effects, and if you did not want to add those to your prop, you're pretty much done now. But if you're interested in adding some blood and gore to your prop, let's continue. To start my blood effects, I'm going to be using some permablood from Pale Night. If you have not used permablood, this stuff is pretty awesome. It is a little bit on the expensive side and it will stain, so definitely don't do this on your kitchen counter. But it is a great blood substitute that has more of a congealed look to it and it stays glossy. Using a 1-inch chip brush, I start at the edge of the blade and I pull the permablood back over the surface. This is going to help simulate the blade cutting through something rather than it just going up and hitting the side of it. At this point, the permablood looks good and I'm going to allow it to dry completely. While it dries, let me go ahead and finish the handle. Some Liquitex Red Oxide and Burnt Sienna are going to be mixed together and dry brushed onto certain sections of the handle. One thing I'm visually trying to focus on here is keeping it separated from the rest of the blade. My permablood is dry and now it's time to add some gore. And my favorite gore method that I've come up with is using some 5-minute epoxy. Not only is this a quick method, but after you add some acrylics and permablood into the 5-minute epoxy, just like the permablood itself, it will maintain a glossy sheen. After the 5-minute epoxy has been thoroughly mixed up, I'll once again use a 1-inch chip brush to apply this to the surface. Just like the permablood, the majority of the strokes need to be directional. The only time that changes is if I'm adding clumps of this mixture directly to the blade. This is by far one of the best paint and weathering videos I think I've put out there. It's definitely one of those processes that can lend itself to multiple different props that are out there, even if you're not making this particular one. so you all can see what it takes to put together Pyramid Head's great knife from Silent Hill 2. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some of my HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.